The summer heat that settled over the tobacco fields of eastern Tennessee in the July of 1842 was the kind that pressed against the skin like a hand that would not lift. It arrived before dawn and stayed past dark, sitting in the air between the packed earth paths of the quarters and the white-painted walls of the Crestwood house like something alive and purposeful. The smell of curing tobacco drifted across everything, sweet and heavy, mixing with the red clay dust that coated every surface and the particular sourness of bodies pushed past the limits of endurance day after day under a sun that made no distinctions. The Crestwood plantation sat on 1,100 acres of prime Tennessee soil 8 miles east of the town of Harrow's Crossing, and its prosperity was measured in 2 sets of numbers that appeared in different ledgers kept in different rooms. One set documented the tobacco yields, the land values, the credit arrangements with merchants in Nashville and Knoxville, the furniture and silver and imported cloth that filled the main house with the evidence of success. The other set, kept in a locked drawer in the study of the man who owned the property, documented the names and ages and assigned values of the 60 people whose labor made every number in the first set possible. Miriam had been born on the Crestwood property in the early spring of 1819. The daughter of a woman named Ida, who had come to Tennessee from a plantation in the Carolinas at the age of 9, and who had spent the following 30 years in the service of the Crestwood household. Miriam had grown up watching her mother move through the main house, with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned that survival depends on being present without being noticed, useful without being remembered, close enough to serve and far enough from human consideration to be safe. Ida had passed this knowledge to her daughter the way she passed everything of value, in whispers at night, when the quarters were quiet enough to speak without being overheard. "The mind is yours," Ida told her. "Everything else they can take and have taken and will take again, but what you carry in here." She would press her finger against her daughter's temple with a gentleness that contradicted the weight of the words. "That is the only thing in this world that belongs entirely to you. Guard it, fill it, use it when the time comes." Miriam had understood from early childhood that her mother meant something specific by the mind. She did not mean comfort or refuge. She meant capacity. She meant the accumulation of knowledge in the only way available to a person denied formal education. Through observation, through listening from doorways and beneath windows, through the careful study of documents handled as part of domestic work, through the slow and secret construction of literacy from fragments, from discarded newspapers, from the letters her mother was sometimes asked to carry between rooms, from the particular pattern of marks on the pages that Miriam taught herself, over years, to decode with a patience that had no alternative but itself. Master Douglas Crestwood was a man of 56, who wore his authority as a physical attribute, something built into his bearing and his voice and the particular way he occupied space in every room he entered. He had inherited the plantation from his father at the age of 28 and had expanded it methodically in the years since, adding acreage and adding people with the same calculating patience he applied to everything he managed. His wife, Eleanor, was a woman of considerable social intelligence, whose management of the household reflected a precision that extended to every detail of the domestic operation, including the careful monitoring of the enslaved women who worked inside the house, whom she watched with a particular attention that came from her awareness that proximity to the family created knowledge that could be dangerous. Their son, Harlan, was 24 and had returned from 2 years in Nashville with ambitions that the plantation could not entirely contain. Their daughter, Frances, was 19 and spent her days in the performance of accomplishments that had been designed to make her suitable for the kind of marriage that would further the family's position in the county. Their younger son, Amos, was 16 and had developed his father's taste for cruelty without his father's discipline, which made him something more immediately dangerous than his parents in the day-to-day experience of the people who served the household. Miriam occupied a position in the Crestwood world that was both privileged and precarious, in the way that intelligence always made precarious, the position of people whom the system required to remain ignorant. She was trusted with work that required attention and capability because her capabilities had proved themselves unavoidable over years of service. She was assigned to manage the household linen, to supervise the preparation of certain meals, to assist Eleanor Crestwood with correspondence when the mistress's own writing was insufficient to the task. This last assignment had provided Miriam with access to information that no single enslaved person on the property should have possessed, and she had used that access with the careful discretion of someone who understood that knowledge was most valuable when its source remained invisible. By the spring of 1842, Miriam had been secretly maintaining a written record for nearly 3 years. She had acquired her materials through the same invisible channels that had given her everything else she had managed to accumulate, carefully, slowly, over time. Scraps of paper from the household waste, ink made from boiled walnut shells, and a formula she had read about in a pamphlet discarded in the study. A space beneath the third floorboard from the wall in the corner of the cabin she shared with 2 other women, a space barely large enough for the folded papers. She pressed into it each night before sleeping. The record she was building was not a diary in any ordinary sense. It was a document. It was evidence. It had been assembled with the understanding that it might someday need to serve a purpose larger than the mind of the woman who created it. And so it was written with a precision and an attention to verifiable detail that reflected an intelligence operating under the constant pressure of concealment and danger. The Crestwood brothers, Douglas and his younger brother Emmett, who served as the plantation's operational overseer, had established over a decade of collaboration a system of management that went beyond the particular brutalities that Tennessee law permitted and indeed expected of slaveholders. What they had created was something more systematic, a method of control refined through experimentation and documented in the correspondence that passed between them, and a network of like-minded men throughout the county and beyond. Miriam had been reading pieces of this correspondence for 3 years, carrying letters between Douglas Crestwood's study and the various rooms where he received visitors, observing exchanges she was assumed to be incapable of understanding, and building from these fragments a picture of what had been happening at Crestwood, and what was being planned. The plantation records from Harrow's Crossing, subsequently preserved in the Knox County Historical Archive after their discovery during a courthouse renovation in 1951, revealed the scope of what Emmett Crestwood managed on behalf of the family operation. 63 individuals in bondage, assessed value $41,000, primary crop, tobacco, secondary, corn, disciplinary incidents, notated in a separate column using a numerical code that required a key provided in a different document to decipher. The key, when found alongside the records, transformed the numbers into a catalogue of violence that the archive's cataloging historian described in her notes as extraordinary in its comprehensiveness and its apparent absence of remorse. The autumn of 1841 had brought a harvest that came in below Douglas Crestwood's expectations, and his response to financial disappointment was predictable in the way that predictability had become its own form of terror on the Crestwood property. Rations were reduced, the pace of work in the remaining fields increased, Emmett's freedom to improvise in the application of discipline was expanded without formal acknowledgement, which was its own kind of official permission. Miriam watched all of this with the documenting attention she had cultivated over years, and she added what she observed to the papers beneath the floorboard, and she waited, because waiting had always been the only strategy available, and she had become expert in its application. What changed in the winter of 1842 was not Miriam's resolve, which had been settled for longer than she could precisely remember, but her timeline. She overheard, in the way she overheard everything significant, from a position of apparent occupation with an assigned task in an adjacent room, a conversation between Douglas Crestwood and his factor, a Nashville merchant named Giles, who visited the plantation in February to discuss the coming year's financial arrangements. The conversation concerned the coming summer. Crestwood's financial position required adjustment. The plantation's workforce was larger than the current operation's profitability could sustain. Giles had buyers in the cotton country of Alabama and Mississippi who were offering favorable prices for working-age individuals, particularly those with household skills that transferred well to the domestic operations of newly established properties. They discussed numbers. They discussed names. Miriam heard her own name among them. She heard her mother's name. She heard the name of a man named Tobias, who had been her closest ally among the field workers for 6 years, who had a daughter named Pearl who was 11 years old, and who had been identified by Francis Crestwood as a promising candidate for domestic training, which was its own specific category of danger. Miriam finished the task she was performing in the adjacent room. She carried the items she had been organizing back to their designated locations. She returned to her cabin in the early evening when her work was complete, and she lay on her sleeping mat and looked at the ceiling in the dark for a long time without moving. The papers beneath the floorboard contained 3 years of carefully assembled evidence. They would mean nothing if they remained where they were. They would mean everything if they reached the right hands. The question, the one she had been postponing for 3 years with the discipline of someone who understood that acting too early was as fatal as acting too late, was whether the time to move had finally arrived. She understood the risks with the clarity of someone who had spent years cataloguing what happened to people on the Crestwood property who miscalculated. She knew the names of 3 people who had attempted to leave in the years before her documentation began, and she knew what had happened to each of them through the accounts of those who had witnessed the consequences. The Crestwood brothers did not simply pursue runaways in the manner of plantation owners who regarded flight as a property problem. They treated it as an opportunity, a demonstration conducted for the benefit of the remaining workforce, a lesson in what the system could do to people who refused its terms. What shifted that February night was not courage. Exactly, because Miriam did not understand what she had been accumulating over 3 years as a form of courage. She understood it as preparation. And preparation, by its nature, is only meaningful when it reaches the moment it was prepared for. She had been ready, in the specific sense of having assembled everything that readiness required, for longer than she admitted to herself. The conversation she overheard in the study had simply removed the last remaining reason to wait. There was a woman in Harrow's Crossing, named Cora Whitfield, who operated a small, dry goods business that served both the town's white residents and, in a separate entrance and a separate part of the store, the free black community that existed on the town's margins, with the precarious permanence of people who have learned to make themselves useful enough to tolerate. Cora Whitfield was a free woman of color, born free in Pennsylvania and moved south with a husband who had since died, and she had lived in Harrow's Crossing for 12 years, conducting business that appeared to be exactly what it appeared to be, which was the surest indication available that it was also something more. Miriam knew about Cora the way she knew about most things that mattered, through the network of communicated awareness that connected the enslaved community across the county through church gatherings and market days, and the particular efficiency of information traveling among people who had every reason to pay attention and no safe outlet except each other. She had never had reason to reach Cora before. The plantation's weekly market trip, which Miriam was sometimes included in as a supervisor of the household's purchasing, would provide the opportunity. The question was what to send and how to send it. The message she composed in her mind over 3 days was 7 words, communicated not in writing, which would have been too dangerous, but verbally, through a woman named Delia who went to the market every week and who had an understanding with a woman who worked in Cora's store that had been operating for years without anyone in the position of authority choosing to examine it. The 7 words were, "I have papers. I need a way north." The response came back 11 days later through the same channel. 2 sentences. "The creek bends east before it runs straight. Follow it on a moonless night." Miriam spent 4 days with those 2 sentences before she understood. They were not metaphor, but geography, specific instructions about the creek that ran along the plantation's eastern boundary, and the particular bend in its course that provided concealment from both the main road and the overseer's regular night patrol. She also understood that the instructions implied a contact who would be waiting, which implied a network, which implied something she had heard described only in the most carefully indirect language in the quarters, but which she now understood was real and specific and available to her. She told Tobias on a cold March night, when they were both assigned to a storage task that gave them legitimate reason to be working together. After the main house had gone dark, she watched him receive the information with the expression of a man who has been carrying a question for years and has just received an answer he cannot fully believe. He thought of his daughter Pearl. He said, when she said, "April, a moonless night, after the planting starts, when extra work makes extra movement less notable." He said, "Who else?" She said, "My mother." He said, "My daughter." She said, "Yes." The weeks between that conversation and the night of departure were the most demanding of Miriam's life, not because of what she had to do, but because of what she had to appear not to be doing. She maintained the exact quality of service that had always characterized her work in the Crestwood household. She anticipated Eleanor Crestwood's requirements with the same attentive efficiency. She supervised the household tasks she was assigned with the same careful attention to detail. She moved through the Crestwood world, as she had always moved through it, like something necessary and unremarkable, present and unnoticed. Inside that performance, she was working with the methodical care of someone who understood that a single error in any direction would end everything. She added the final entries to her documentation: the February conversation she had overheard, the names that had been discussed, the prices that had been mentioned, the names of the Nashville merchants who had been identified as buyers. She folded the papers into the smallest possible configuration and wrapped them in oilcloths she had saved from the kitchen waste and pressed them into the space beneath the floorboard, and considered that they might remain there forever if the plan failed, and that if the plan failed, the papers would be the least of what was lost. She also considered what she would do if they reached their destination and the papers reached hands capable of acting on what they contained. The documentation described crimes, some of which exceeded the brutal permissions that Tennessee law extended to slave owners, and others of which were so deeply embedded in the legal structure of slavery itself that no court in the state would have acknowledged them as crimes at all. The value of the documentation was not primarily legal. Its value was moral and political, the kind of evidence that the growing abolitionist movement in the North had been describing as necessary, the kind of testimony that could not be dismissed as theoretical or exaggerated because it was specific, named, dated, written in the hand of someone who had been present. The night they chose was the second Tuesday of April, 1842, when the moon was absent, and the rain that had been threatening for days finally arrived in a steady, cold downpour that reduced visibility to 20 feet and turned the ground to mud that would hold no footprints. Rain was good. Miriam had been watching the sky for weeks with the particular attention of someone for whom weather had become tactical. Rain reduced the dog's ability to track. It kept the overseer in his office rather than on his rounds. It gave anyone moving through the night a legitimate excuse for the sounds of movement that wet weather produced. There were 5 of them in the end. Miriam and her mother Ida, whose age and condition required them to move more slowly than the plan ideally demanded. Tobias and Pearl, the girl carrying a cloth bag with everything she owned in the world, which was not much and was precisely the weight a child could carry through the dark, and a man named Cornelius, who was 51 years old and had lived on the Crestwood property since before Miriam was born, and who, when Miriam came to him in the last week of March and told him what she was planning, sat very still for a long moment and then said, "I thought this moment would not come before I died. I am glad I was wrong." Miriam was the last one out of the quarters. She retrieved the oilcloth package from beneath the floorboard and pressed it against her body beneath her outer layer of clothing, and she stood in the doorway of the cabin for a moment and looked at what she was leaving: a sleeping mat worn thin from years of use, a wooden comb her mother had made, a piece of mirror glass smaller than her palm that she had found in the kitchen waste years ago and kept because it was the only surface in her world that reflected her face back to herself. She left the comb and the mirror. She turned away from them and walked into the rain. They followed the creek to its eastern bend, moving in single file with Miriam at the front, navigating by the sound of water that she had memorized during the daylight hours of the previous week. The creek was higher than usual from the rain, its voice louder, which helped, and also made crossing points harder to identify. Ida's breathing was audible beside her. Pearl moved with the careful silence of a child who understood, at 11 years old, the specific weight of the silence required. Cornelius at the back moved with a slowness that his arthritic joints demanded, and that he compensated for with an absolute absence of the sounds that quicker movement might have produced. At the bend where the creek curved east before straightening toward the road, a man was waiting. Miriam had never seen him before, but recognized him with the recognition that context provides. A man sitting on the bank in the rain with the patience of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. He said nothing. He gestured with his head in the direction they needed to go. They followed. What came after was 11 days of movement through a Tennessee countryside that was legally hostile to their existence, guided by a chain of people whose names Miriam would never know in their entirety, because the system they were part of was designed around the safety of not knowing, each link aware only of the link immediately adjacent, the whole visible to no single person and therefore impossible to extract under pressure. A barn outside a small farming community, a root cellar beneath a house whose owners never appeared but whose provisions appeared in the dark, each morning with the reliability of something organized and intentional. A flatboat on a river in the middle of the second night, moving north through dark water, with the oarsmen working in silence and the 5 passengers pressed together in the hull. There were 2 moments when Miriam believed the journey would not succeed. On the 4th night, passing through a town whose name she never learned, a man on horseback came round a corner at the same moment they were crossing a street, and the 5 of them pressed into a doorway in the dark and waited through what felt like several full minutes of held breath, while the horses' hooves continued down the road and the sound faded. On the 8th day, hidden in a hay barn while a search party moved through the adjacent fields, Pearl developed a cough that Tobias managed by pressing his coat against her face and holding her against his chest and singing below the threshold of sound until the coughing subsided. A moment that Miriam watched from her position in the dark and understood as one of the most precise demonstrations of love she would ever witness. They crossed into Ohio on the 12th day of April. In the gray early morning, Cincinnati rose above the river in a way that Miriam, who had never seen a city, received as something beyond what she had the vocabulary to describe. The sounds alone, the commerce, the bells, the movement of people and animals and vehicles in numbers she had no context for, arrived across the water as evidence of a world whose existence she had constructed, theoretically from fragments, but had never before experienced with her senses. She stood on the northern bank and held her mother's hand and felt something that had no name in the language available to her. Something that was neither joy nor relief, but was perhaps the physical sensation of a particular kind of weight, leaving the body at last. Ida said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Your grandmother would not believe this place." Miriam did not know which grandmother she meant, because Ida had rarely spoken of her own mother, and she understood that the sentence was not really about her grandmother, but about everyone who had lived and died in that place and had not had this moment, and the specific quality of obligation that surviving them created. She pressed her mother's hand, and they walked into the city. There is a document in the records of the Cincinnati Anti-Slavery League, filed in April of 1842, that records the arrival of a party of 5 individuals from a Tennessee tobacco plantation whose name is deliberately omitted from the filing in the practice the League maintained of protecting roots by removing identifying details. The document notes the party's composition: 2 older women, 1 man of middle age, 1 younger man, and a female child, all in adequate condition given the journey's demands. A notation in the margin in different ink, added later, reads, "The older woman in this group was unable to continue travel and died peacefully in the house of a League supporter in late May. She had expressed contentment in the final weeks. She was Ida, and she had been in bondage for 47 years, and she died in a room north of the river where the only person directing her time was herself, which was not everything, but was what she had been denied for her entire adult life, and was, by any measure that mattered, what she had deserved all along." The documentation Miriam had carried in the oilcloth package beneath her clothing arrived at the offices of the Ohio Anti-Slavery League in the 3rd week of April, 1842, and the response to its contents among the League's leadership was described in a letter from the League's corresponding secretary to colleagues in Philadelphia as the most significant single piece of evidence from within a working plantation that we have yet received. The entries recorded with clinical precision a series of events at the Crestwood property that exceeded even the broad legal permissions that Tennessee slavery extended to property owners, and their specificity, their named individuals, their dates, their reference to documented correspondence, made them resistant to the dismissal as fabrication that Southern apologists typically applied to abolitionist accounts of plantation conditions. The decision about what to do with the documentation required several weeks of deliberation that Miriam participated in, to the considerable surprise of the League's male leadership, who had not anticipated that the woman who had created the evidence would have considered views about how it should be deployed. She had considered views. She expressed them with a directness that one League member recorded in his private journal as startling in its clarity and rhetorical precision for someone entirely. She said the documentation should not be used primarily as an appeal to Northern sympathy. It should be used as a legal instrument wherever possible, directed at the networks of merchants and officials and professionals whose complicity in the Crestwood operations was documented in the papers she had assembled. She said that the purpose of evidence was accountability, and that accountability required specificity, and that the League should resist the temptation to transform her particular documentation into general sentiment. The League followed her recommendation only partially, which was more than she had expected. Selected entries from her journal were published in the abolitionist press in the summer of 1842, with identifying details of the plantation and its location carefully altered to protect those who had assisted the escape, while preserving the documented specificity of the crimes described. The response in northern newspapers was significant. The response in southern newspapers was the defensive fury of people recognizing something accurate that they could not afford to acknowledge as accurate. Douglas Crestwood's response to the disappearance of 5 members of his household was documented in a complaint filed with the Harrows Crossing Sheriff's Office on April 14, 1842, 2 days after the escape, at which point the winter illness that had been attributed to the missing workers was officially reclassified as flight. The complaint estimated the financial loss from the escape at $6,000 and requested the full cooperation of law enforcement authorities in the pursuit and return of the absconded property. A second document, a letter to a Nashville merchant associate written the same week and preserved in a private family archive, expressed the controlled anger of a man whose certainty about the permanent nature of his arrangements had been disrupted by something he had not believed possible, that a woman he had owned for 23 years had possessed, all along, capacities he had never noticed, and had used those capacities against him with a precision that his subsequent investigation could only partially reconstruct. The sheriff's pursuit was thorough in the manner of all such pursuits and unsuccessful in the manner of all such pursuits that follow a route already designed to defeat them. The trail ended at the eastern bend of the creek, where the rain had erased everything, and the subsequent investigation found no witnesses willing to testify to what they might have seen, which was not because no one had seen anything, but because the people who had seen things had their own long practice of seeing nothing in the presence of official authority. In the months that followed, the Crestwood plantation continued its operations under conditions of heightened surveillance that achieved, as such heightened surveillance always achieved, the appearance of control, while the reality of what lay beneath continued undisturbed. A woman named Rosa, who had known Miriam since childhood, began telling versions of the story to children in the quarters on winter evenings, versions that changed with each telling in the way that oral transmission changes everything it carries, accumulating meaning and losing specific detail until what remains is the essential shape of the thing, which is also the most durable part of it. Miriam spent the first year in Cincinnati in the care of the Anti-Slavery League's network, which provided housing and connections to employment and a community of people who were engaged in the work she had been preparing herself for without knowing it was called that. She found work as a seamstress in a workshop owned by a woman who had made a practice of employing people newly arrived from the South and who asked no questions about origins and paid wages that were fair by the standards of the city. She saved money with the discipline of someone who understands that financial independence is the material form of the freedom she has been carrying in the abstract for years. She also began writing in earnest, not documentation now, but testimony, the full account of what she had witnessed over her years at Crestwood, organized for readers who had not been there and needed context, who required not just the facts but the human dimensions of the facts, the weight of what it meant to live inside the system she was describing. The Anti-Slavery League's publishing contacts facilitated the distribution of these accounts to newspapers and pamphlets across the North. Her writing attracted attention both for its content and for the quality of its expression, which challenged the patronizing assumptions about intellectual capacity that formed one of slavery's most necessary justifications. A letter from a Philadelphia abolitionist leader, written in September of 1842 and preserved in the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society's archive, described a meeting with Miriam in terms that indicated some surprise at encountering an argument more systematic and a rhetorical capacity more developed than the correspondent had anticipated. "She possesses what I can only describe as the voice of witness," he wrote. "Combined with the analytical mind of a strategist, the two together make her the most compelling advocate I have encountered for the cause that I have given my life to. I am somewhat ashamed to note that I did not expect this." Tobias found work in the city's construction trades, where his skills were both needed and compensated. Pearl was enrolled in the school maintained by the League for Children of People newly arrived from the South, and she proved, in the unsurprised assessment of her teachers, to be a student of considerable ability whose curiosity about the world she had been prevented from accessing was powerful enough to make up for the years of formal education she had been denied. Her enrollment records, preserved in the school's archive, show her name listed in the fall of 1842 as a new student of approximate age 11 years. Prior education none documented. By the spring of 1843, her teacher's notes describe her as among the most advanced in her cohort. Cornelius lived in a room in a house 3 streets from the school and worked as a woodworker for an employer who had never asked him a question about his origins and had expressed no curiosity about the story that his capable and quiet employee carried. He died in the summer of 1845 and was buried in the city's Free Black Cemetery with a service attended by the entire community that had formed around the people who had come north together. The minister who spoke at his burial said that he had been a man of great patience and great courage, and that the courage was more visible in retrospect than it had been at the time, which was perhaps the most honest thing that could be said about the courage required to endure 60 years in bondage, and then to walk away from it in the dark and the rain. In the years that followed her arrival in Cincinnati, Miriam became a figure of some significance in the abolitionist movement, not as a symbol, which was how the movement's leadership initially attempted to use her, but as a strategist, which was what she actually was. Her speaking engagements in churches and meeting halls throughout Ohio and Pennsylvania drew audiences that included not just the already convinced but people who came with skepticism and left with something they had not possessed before: the specific weight of detailed testimony from someone who had been inside the system they were trying to understand from the outside, per collaboration with other escapees who had arrived through the same network produced over the years from 1843 to 1849. A series of testimonies published in collected form that the Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia described as the most comprehensive documentation of plantation operations yet assembled in a single volume. The specificity she demanded from contributors, the same clinical attention to verifiable detail she had applied to her own documentation, made the collection resistant to the accusations of exaggeration that Southern apologists routinely directed at abolitionist literature. It was difficult to dismiss accounts that named names and gave dates and described the physical layouts of specific buildings that could be verified. In the fall of 1847, a pamphlet arrived at the Harrow's Crossing post office addressed to Douglas Crestwood under his full name at his stated address. Its contents were extracts from the published accounts, with a cover letter from the Anti-Slavery Society of Ohio noting that the named individuals described in the enclosed documentation had been identified as responsible for specific acts that exceeded the legal permissions extended to Tennessee, and that copies of the full documentation had been provided to legal authorities in Ohio and to members of the United States Congress who were engaged with the question of slavery's legal status. Crestwood's response to this letter was not documented. The fear it produced in him and in the network of associates implicated in his operations was documented indirectly in a subsequent reduction in the scope of the activities that the documentation described, which was not justice but was something. Miriam's final documented public appearance before her trial grew deliberately quiet occurred at a gathering in Philadelphia in the winter of 1849, where she delivered a speech that her host described in a letter to a colleague as the most carefully reasoned argument I have heard in 20 years of engagement with this cause. The argument concerned not just the injustice of slavery, but the specific mechanisms by which systems of total power maintained themselves, the ways they depended on the invisibility of the people they controlled, the ways they created the very conditions that made their own eventual failure inevitable, because systems that depend on the perpetual blindness of the powerful to the capacities of the powerless carry within them the instrument of their own undoing. She had learned this not from books but from living it. She understood it not as theory but as experience. That combination, she told her audience, was both the heaviest thing she carried and the thing that made the weight bearable. After 1850, Miriam's activities became deliberately impossible to trace, which was itself a kind of documentation of what she had become, someone whose work required the same invisibility that had once been imposed on her by force but was now chosen as a strategic necessity. Reports from the network suggested she had moved several times, possibly returning south on specific operations, possibly working in the organizational infrastructure that supported the movement's most sensitive activities. Whether any of the accounts that circulated of a composed and careful black woman seen near specific plantation properties in the years before the war were accounts of her specifically, or of the many people her example had made possible, it was impossible to say with certainty. What was certain was that the example existed and that it traveled through the underground networks of the enslaved South with the efficiency of something that had been waiting to be believed. When the war finally came and the legal architecture that had defined the world of her birth began its collapse under forces that had been building for a generation, Miriam was in her early 40s, living in a city whose name does not appear in any document that has survived. The journal she had maintained at Crestwood, published in its complete form after emancipation, was entered into the record of the Congressional Investigation into Slavery's Crimes as Exhibit 47 in a proceeding that attempted, with limited success, to extend some legal accountability to the highest levels of the system that had produced it. The proceeding's limited success was its own kind of documentation, a record of what the law could and could not bring itself to do with the evidence it had been given. Today the land where the Crestwood plantation stood is divided between a state highway and a soybean operation whose current owners have no memory of what their soil contains. The main house is gone, burned in a fire in 1891 under circumstances that the county record describes as accidental. The quarters are gone. The tobacco fields are gone. What remains is a small cemetery plot, fenced and mostly untended, where the markers for the Crestwood family stand in various stages of weather-worn illegibility. There is no marker for anyone else who lived on that property, which is not surprising and is its own kind of historical document, a record of what the people who made the markers decided was worth recording and what they decided was not. But the land holds what happened on it, in the way that land holds everything, in silence, in the particular quality of the light on summer mornings, when the heat returns and the smell of the earth rises and the fields are still before the day begins, when the distance between what was and what is becomes briefly, specifically, apparent to anyone willing to stand still long enough to feel it.